So CSS is how we add styling to the page. This MDN page, how CSS works, is a good resource for learning about how to use CSS. We're just going to start adding it to the page, and we'll talk about what it's doing as we add it, and how the syntax works. But it's a separate page that we have in our folder. And part of the reason it's separate is so that we can apply it to multiple different pages. So when we're creating a website, let me do like a little drawing. Wait, I have Photoshop open. I'll just use that. Okay. So I'm going to do a really bad drawing with my mouse, but when we're creating a website, actually, let me just use shapes because I probably won't be able to draw well enough. So if we have an HTML page here, let's say red is for HTML. That's our index page. This is our about page. This is our part 1. This is our part 2, whatever. We have all these HTML pages. Okay, so these are all our HTML pages. Then we're also going to create a CSS page. So let's say our CSS page is blue. And the CSS page is going to tell the HTML pages what to look like. And so the thing that's cool about HTML and CSS is I only need one CSS page, and I can apply it to all of my HTML pages. And with most websites, the style of the page is going to stay the same across the website. If we look at our class website, the style of the text is always the same, the background is always the same, the basic structure is always the same. All these things are the same. So instead of recreating that style over and over again, we're going to make one CSS page, and we're going to apply it to all of our HTML pages. So to create our CSS page, we have to make a new file. So you can go to Sublime and do File, New File, or you can just hit Command N. And let's save it first. So we're going to save as. And usually we just call this style.css. You can call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter that much, but style.css is usually what we call it. And sometimes you have like a lot of style sheets that do different things, but we're just going to start simple. So we talked about comments with HTML. There's also comments in CSS. So if I hit Command Option question mark, it makes this little comment like this. It looks a little bit different than the HTML one because it's a different language. So the syntax is different, but it's still a comment. So this is a comment. This isn't going to be read by the computer. It's going to be ignored. It's just for us to make notes about how the style works. So when we're writing a CSS rule, we have to select what element we want to apply the rule to. So in our HTML, we have all these different elements like HTML, head, body, etc. And so what we do with CSS is we use the name of the different elements, and that's called selecting. So if I say selector in CSS, I'm talking about selecting the element. So let's start with the body. So I just type the name of the element for my rule, and then I put curly brackets like this, and everything that's inside those curly brackets gets applied to that element. So I'm going to hit enter here, and notice that Sublime indents for me. So it's doing the same thing as our HTML. This indent doesn't have any functional purpose, but it makes it easier to read. If all of my rules were in one long line, it would be really hard to read. Okay, so that's how we select part of our HTML. The next thing that we want to do is write a rule. So a CSS rule has two parts. It has the thing that we want to change and then how we want to change it. So for the body section, one thing that we might want to change is the background color. And so if I say background, and again, Sublime is going to fill this stuff in for me because it knows all the CSS rules. So I can say background, I can find this thing called background color and hit enter. And in CSS, there's a bunch of colors that just have names. So we can just use a name for the color. So for this one, let's say we want it to be pink. And it'll actually show me in Sublime like what some of the options are. So I'm going to go with pink. And so now if I go back to Chrome and I reload, oh, I forgot to attach my style sheet. Okay, so you have to actually tell the HTML where to find the style sheet. So that's what I forgot to do. So let's go back to index.html real quick. And there's a special way to do this. There's a special tag for telling your HTML page where to find the style sheet. And so I'm going to make a new tag, and this tag is called a link tag. And if I hit enter, it's going to fill it in for me. So that's another thing that Sublime will do for you. A lot of the tags have, basic rules or attributes. So if I actually just hit enter, you can see Sublime is going to fill all this stuff in for me. But what's here is the rel. This is the relationship, which is it's a style sheet. This is the type, which is text/CSS, and then the href is kind of like our anchor tag href. The href is actually where the CSS page is. And so it's in the same folder. I'm going to put this at the beginning because it's more important. It's in the same folder, so to tell it where the style sheet is, we just say style.css. And so now our HTML page will be able to find our style sheet. So I'm going to save that, Command S, and go back to Chrome and reload. And we have our first style. So now our website background is pink. So if you want to know what other colors are available, there's a really good site for this called HTML Color Codes. And you can see all of the different colors here. So there's a bunch of different names for colors that you can just use for red, pink, orange, yellow, purple, etc. I'll put this on the Discord and I'll link it in the video when I post it later. But there's also other ways of creating colors. There isn't a name for every single color because there's lots and lots of colors. So another thing that you can do is use the color picker, and you can use what's called the hex value. So you can also use hex values. So if I wanted to get like a slightly different pink, I can use this hex value here. So I just selected that and copied it. And I'm going to go to my style sheet, and I'm going to take out pink and put the hex number and save. And so now my page actually matches my Chrome theme a little bit. So the hex value is just like a special type of number that can hold more numbers because it uses letters as digits. So usually when we count using 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. In hex, you can count up to 9, but then you can keep counting using A, B, C, D, E, F. And so you actually have 6 extra digits. So you have each character could represent 16 numbers instead of 10 numbers. So you don't actually really need to know how it works, but that's just a quick explanation of why we use it. It's a more efficient data format. Okay, so we can change the color. So CSS, there's like a lot of different stuff that you can do. You're not going to be able to memorize all of the CSS rules, and that's not really the point. What's more important is to know what to look for. So if you want to know how to do something, it's important to be able to Google it. So the next thing I might want to do is change the font. It's a pretty boring font. So if I Google CSS font, I'm going to come up with some options. So you'll usually see these two results as the first results. W3 Schools and MDN. MDN is like the more official one. W3 schools, people don't like. It does have mostly pretty good information, so it's fine. But a lot of people, prefer MDN. I usually look at MDN because it's going to be more up to date and more authoritative. But so if we look at this, we can see here's some CSS rules: font family, font size, font stretch, font style, font variant, font weight. All these different things change the font. So you can click on these and it'll tell you what it actually does. So the font family is what the actual font that's being used on the page is. And so here are some different options. We can see how these work, and then we can also copy this if we want to use it. So if I click on this and I like this, I can copy it and go back to my code, and I just hit a new line and paste. And so now I have a new font. And one thing that we'll start to notice is that the rules that I apply to the body also get applied to other elements. So when I click on the body section over here in the inspector, we can now see the CSS rules that I've added. And you can also change these rules if you want to try stuff. If I want to try different background colors, I can play around with this color, find something I like, and then maybe I'll take that hex value and replace it. But this doesn't actually permanently change anything. It's just previewing it within Chrome. So you can see the body rule. I set the font family, but all of my fonts have that rule now. So even if I go in the header and look at the H1, you can see right here it says inherited from body. So it inherited this font family from the body. And if I want to change that, I have to make a new rule that only applies to the H1. So that's why CSS is called cascading style sheets, because the styles cascade over the elements. So if I want to change something about the H1, I can write H1, and I can overwrite the previous choice. So I could choose a different font. Let's say I want my headers to look more official. I can choose this Georgia font and paste that in there. And now when I reload this, now I have a different font for my header and this other font for the rest of the text. So that's what cascading in CSS means, is that as I go down my page, this rule is going to overwrite this previous rule. So because the H1 is part of the body, it takes on the rules of the body, but not if we overwrite that rule. So another website that's really useful for fonts is Fontstack, or maybe CSS Fontstack. Yeah, CSSFontstack.com. So this shows you all of the different fonts. It shows you what they look like. And then the thing that's really convenient about this site is it shows you the support. So for some of the most basic fonts, like Arial is a really simple font, you can see the support is close to 100% on Windows and Mac. But some fonts are more supported on one or the other. So this one, Franklin Gothic Medium, is 99% supported on Windows, but only 2% supported on Mac. So if I use this font, you can actually tell it doesn't really look, this isn't really what it looks like, because I'm on a Mac, so we can see, this is pretty basic looking, so I would guess it actually looks like something else. Let's Google it and see if we can see what it is supposed to look like. Okay, so it's supposed to look more like this. It's not that different. Maybe it is working. I can't really tell. But I think this is a default font. Let's look. We can actually just inspect this page and see what it says. Oh, I didn't select the right thing. Okay. Oh, what? Inspect. Okay. So yeah, the font is getting overwritten here. It's getting overwritten here. I don't see where the actual font rule is, but we can go to computed and look at the font family. Yeah, and it's something called Roboto, so it's not actually using that font. Anyway, this is a good website to just see what are the different fonts that I can use, and whether they are supported on different platforms or not. And the other thing that you may have noticed with this font rule is that it actually has like a backup rule. So if you see multiple font rules with a comma in between, that basically means if this one doesn't work on your particular computer, because different computers have different fonts on them, then this is what will be there instead. Sans serif is just like a generic sans serif font. So if you don't know what a sans serif font is, these are all sans serif fonts. It means that it doesn't have like the little feet. These are serif fonts. So you can see they have like little like feet poking out at the bottom of the different font of the different letter styles. So serif fonts are usually for more like print related stuff. They look a little bit like more serious, and sans serif font is for more web or more design oriented things. Okay, so we have a couple fonts. Let's go back to making some more changes. So we can also change the color of the text. That rule is just color. So let's try changing the color to white. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that looks okay. The contrast is not that good because my background is pretty light as well. So let's try some other colors. I'm gonna click on this white and let's see if we can get something with a little more contrast. Maybe like something kind of yellow since the background is purple. This is okay. Something like that might be nice. So I can copy that hex value and go back to my code and replace white like that. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So we can change the colors. We can also change some layout stuff. So that's what we'll spend a little bit more time with. Any questions at this point on CSS? Did the basic syntax make sense? All right, so let's do some layout. So with CSS, we can do color, we can do the font, and we can also do the layout. And we want to make this page look better. So one way to do that is by updating some of the layout stuff. So one thing that you might notice is the page is always on the left. Okay, so there's a couple ways I could deal with that, and I'm going to use the container for this. One thing I can do is I can just align everything to the center. I can say text align center as a rule. That's very simple. It doesn't fix every problem, but it does kind of center the website. So that's an easy thing to add. I can just put that in the body, text align center. This is kind of like an old style that's been around for a long time. Sublime is doing this weird thing where it adds a space. So I don't really need those spaces. So that's kind of nice if we want to actually center like the text. This looks good because we don't have a lot of content. But another way that we can do this, I'm going to turn this off for a second, and I'm going to add a style for our container. So I'm going to make a new line down here, and I'm going to make a new type of CSS rule. So for the body, it's really easy to say, I just want the body tag. For the h1, I can just use the h1 tag. But for my container, I can use the div tag, but in most websites, there's like lots and lots of divs. Like if we look at the CSS or the HTML for this MDN page, you can see there's like, oh, these are all, oh, actually they use a lot of list items. Okay, here we go. You can see they're using tons and tons of divs. There's a div for this. There's another div for this one. There's a bunch of paragraphs. Here's another div here. So if we use div, it's going to apply to a lot of different elements. So what we can do instead is use this ID. And so what an ID is a way for HTML and CSS to talk to each other to say, I only want this specific element. So the ID is kind of like your name. It's like one thing that just applies to you. In a bit, we'll also look at a class, which is more generic. You can create a class that applies to a certain class of elements. So that's more like, you know, our group as a class. We all have certain attributes, like we're all in this particular class. You know, we're all, you know, in this room, etc. But for an ID, that's only one element. So when you add an ID to an HTML element, there should only be one of them. And the way that we can select an ID in CSS is by using the hashtag. So the hashtag in CSS corresponds to the ID in HTML. So I'll put a little comment as a reminder. Hashtag is for ID. And so then we just use the same name for the ID, container. So for this container, I'm going to add a rule here that is very common. And I'm going to set the margin. So margin is the space around an element. And so if I set the margin to, let's say, 100 pixels. So if I'm using pixels, I just use a number and then px for pixels. And then I go back to Chrome. So now we can see a margin has been added to the page. And it's applied to every side. So if I go to my container, you can see margin is 100. Oh, I've scrolled, that's why. Okay. So see that orange area that in the Chrome preview? That's showing me this margin. And so the margin is 100. I can change it down here if I want to, you know, see what it looks like at different values. But notice that it's applied on the top. So there's 100 pixels of margin on the top up here, on the left, and on the right. Okay, so if I move this in here, it moves the content back. Okay, so that's the margin. And there's also a margin on the bottom. And so the margin, we can apply it like this to everything, but we can also apply it to specific sides. So I could say margin dash top, and now it's only going to be at the top of my container. I could say margin dash left, and it's only going to be on the left side of the container. I can also use two rules, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, is if I use two rules, the first rule applies to the top and bottom, and the second rule applies to the right and left. And so if I put 100 pixels and then 50 pixels, now the 50 is the right and left. You can see the orange on this side, and this side is smaller, and the 100 is applied to the top and the bottom. And there's also a special rule that I can add here, which is auto. And what that does is it calculates how big the div is, and then it applies the margin to the rest of the page. But this only works if my margin has a width. So that's another rule that we can go over, is the width. So if I say the width of this container, and I'm going to use something smaller than what most websites use typically these days, because what we're creating is a little bit of an old school style website. So for my width, I'm just going to do 600 pixels. Okay, so now notice that we have centered content, but the text is not centered. So this is how we can center our website without necessarily having to center everything on the page. Okay. So you can also set the height of an element, but in HTML, typically a website scrolls from the top down to the bottom. So most of the time you're not going to be dealing with the height, except for in specific situations. So we can ignore the height value for this. So once I set width, it's always going to be that width. Another thing I can do to make my website responsive, so responsive meaning that it can change with the size of the browser. So if I don't want it to always be 600, I can set a range for how big my content will be. So I'm going to do command ? And that's a convenient way to comment out a rule in your document. So I can leave it there as a note, but it's not going to be applied anymore. So now that width is gone. And so instead I can set a min width. So let's say the minimum width is 400 pixels. And the max width is 800 pixels. So now instead of setting an absolute value for the width, I'm setting a range for how big the page can be. So it can get smaller or larger, and we can't really tell the difference because we don't have a lot of content, but when we change the way the image is laid out, we'll see that change pretty quickly. All right, so we're going to add a couple more things to our layout, but this is already starting to look a bit better. Any questions so far? All right, so let's add a few more things. I know I'm covering a lot, but we can get through these basics, and then we'll have some time for you guys to play around with them on your own. So I'm going to make the max width actually a little bit smaller. I'm going to go with that 600 because I don't want to really deal. I don't have that much content, so I don't want to deal with a lot of extra spacing. So next, what we want to do is one thing I really want to do is put my images next to each other. And so this is where we can start to deal with the layout of our main section. And there's a lot of different ways to approach this. I'm going to go over a couple, but there's no like one way to do this. There's a lot of different options. Okay. So if I want to make my images sit next to each other, one thing I can do is just make them smaller. And so I can select my images using the img tag. And I only have 2 images, and so I can apply these rules to both of them. I'm not really worried about applying rules to all of the images on my page. But most websites with more complicated layouts have lots of images, and so you wouldn't normally want to write a rule like this that's going to select every single image on the page. So what we can do instead, to be careful, is assign these images a class. A class, as I mentioned, is like a type that applies to certain things, but not all things. And so the way that I can do that is I can go into my image, and I can say class equals, and let's just call this this is kind of like a link image, so let's call this a link because it's inside of our anchor tag. So this way we can apply images that have links. We can apply these styles. So I'm going to copy this and paste it into my second image. And so now any style that I add to this class equals link will apply to elements that have the class in it. So it's just like the ID, but the difference is it can be multiple different elements that have the same class. So to create a class, I can say image.link. Okay, so this is another way to do this. I could also do this with my container. I could say div ID container. This is a way to specify the element and an ID or a class. So I can say image.link, and this will only apply to images that have the class. So just like the ID is for, or the hashtag is for ID, this dot is for class. So let's put a note here. Dot is for class. So let's take our image.link and we'll say width. And there's a lot of different rules that we can use for the width. So if we say 100 pixels, now both images are 100 pixels. So they're both pretty small. And so they fit into the layout, but they could be taking up more space, right? So what else could we do? So if I click on one of my images, now you can see my rule here, image.link, width equals 100 pixels. So another thing that we could do is use a percentage. So if I say 50%, it's going to be 50% of the parent window or the parent div, which is this main section, which is 600. And it goes over a little bit because, why does it go over a little bit? There must be some like padding or border or something. Okay, I forget why, because this isn't actually how we normally do stuff anymore. But we can change that width. I can make it bigger. If there's like a default width that I like, I can stick with that, and that'll be fine. But this isn't really what I want to do, because I want my page to be responsive. I want the images to change as I change the page. So let's say I did width is 100%. Now the image takes up the whole area of my layout. And if the page gets smaller, then the image will also get smaller. Okay, so that's cool, but now I only see one image. So now I need to do something a little bit more sophisticated. So what I can do is change the layout of the container, which is this main div. So I can say for the main container, I could say something like, and this is under the display property, I could say it's a grid. And I could say the grid template column. So this is a more complex rule, but I could say it's 50%, 50%. And so now I have my images next to each other because I have two equally apportioned columns. Okay, so this is a bit advanced, but it's way easier to do this than to play around with trying to get the right image sizes. So we're just going to skip ahead to this. And then if I want, I can also make a gap. I can say grid gap is 10 pixels, and that'll put a nice little gap in between our elements. So this is a bit of advanced CSS, but for this particular project, I think it makes sense to use this instead. So there's a bunch of different ways that you could do this, but I think this is probably the nicest solution available. Although it's not lining up now. Oh, because we need to... I wonder if this is a... No, okay. That's kind of funny. So the gap is being added. Now it's bigger than 600 pixels. That's not what I would guess that that would do. That's okay. So other than the 50%, 50% for the two columns, I can also use pixels there. I could say like 200 pixels, 200 pixels, and then I'll get two columns. So that kind of has the same effect, but now it has a specific value. So yeah, so there's a few different ways to do this. One is just setting the direct width of the images, and that's kind of the simple approach. I could make them a little bigger, like width is 200. Or if I want to do something a little bit more complicated, I can set the image width to 100%, and then I can change the layout of the main section. So to do that again, I can say main display is grid. That's going to create a grid. But then with a grid, I have to say how many columns there are. So that rule is grid template columns. And then I just add a value for each column. So if I say 100 pixels, then it's basically the same thing. Each one of my columns is going to be 100 pixels. But if I want to divide it up evenly, I can say 50%, 50%. So now I have two columns that have 50%. And then if I want a little gap, I can say grid gap and say 10 pixels. And it really should be applying it in a different way. I'm going to have to Google that because that's not what I would have expected. What if we say border box sizing border box. Okay, I'm gonna Google this. So CSS grid gap doesn't fit in width. Let's see. This isn't exactly what I want. Oh, maybe. Oh, actually, maybe what I need is 1FR, 1FR. Sorry, there's actually a lot of different rules. There we go. Okay. So a better way to do this actually is to use the FR, which is essentially stands for a fractional unit. And so if we're dividing our grid into two parts, if we say 1FR, that basically means take the total number of these units, which is 2, and then apply 1 to the first column and 2 to the second column. This is actually a better way to do layout too, because if I say like 2FR, 1FR, you can make more complex layouts. So now this bird is twice as big as this one, but you know, it still fits inside the layout. So that's what I should be using instead of 50%. So it's a little more complicated, but it's easier in terms of the actual just number. It's just 1FR, 1FR. Again, you don't have to do it this way. This is the more modern way to do it, but you can also just set the width of the images directly by saying like 100 pixels, or if we want to match our layout, we could say like 200 pixels. But I'm going to comment this one out. Okay, so that's enough CSS to cover. I'm going to do more CSS next week, and we're also going to look at a few other things like finishing up the project and publishing and stuff like that. But I think this is a pretty good intro. As I mentioned before, there's just like basically tons and tons of CSS rules. There's no real way to know all of them. So the best thing to do is if you want to do something, just Google it. So if you're like, I want to add like a border around the image, the best way to figure that out is just to say CSS border. And you'll see some stuff here. You can go to MDN. You can try out these different rules. And then if you like one, if you're like, this is really cool, you can copy it, go back to your CSS and put it in, and then take a look at how it looks. Looks kind of goofy, but it is kind of, maybe that's what you want. It actually looks kind of cool, I think. Although they're overlapping. So one last little rule that's going to save you a lot of headaches is the the box sizing rule. This is a rule that, oh, it didn't actually fix this. Never mind. Let's see. How would we fix this? We'd have to like incorporate the border. Oh, I don't even know what. What if we just use a regular unit, like 10 pixels? There we go. Okay, that's a little bit better. Anyway, so you can, the main thing that you have to be able to do with CSS is just Google stuff and then read the rule and figure out how it works. So border solid, okay, that makes sense. There's a solid border. Border dashed red, that makes sense. It's dashed and it's red. So there's the style and the color. Then border 1 REM solid. REM is a unit that is related to the size of the text. And then border thick double, so you can see it's doubled. So basically with CSS, you know, you got to just like Google stuff and figure out how they work, because there's too many rules to actually learn in, you know, a couple classes. But for what we're making, you don't need to have anything that's too crazy complicated. You know, something simple is good. You don't really need to, oh, maybe if I increase the grid gap, there we go. So that actually looks kind of cool. I don't know. Whatever. All right, so I'm gonna